Hi, my name's Elaine. I'm the CEO of Hyphenate. And the reason we chose this topic today is because we know that a lot of organisations are delaying their new technology launches due to lockdown. But I wanted to share the story of Comic Relief because they've actually had a really successful Salesforce implementation in the past few months. So I'm delighted to be joined by Jacqui Lowe from Comic Relief. Hi, Jacqui.
Hi, I'm Jacqui Lowe. I'm Systems Manager at Comic Relief, and I'm going to talk through our experience of using an Agile approach and launching new technology during lockdown, and share some advice based on things that we have learned over the last few months.
So firstly, what are the three key elements that led to success? These were MVP, which stands for Minimum Viable Product. And this has become a really popular term to describe the concept of keeping the solution relatively simple and not trying to do it all and seek perfection for day one. So we'll be coming more onto this. Also, agile delivery. And taking an agile approach means that rather than designing and documenting the final solution specification up front and delivering a full solution at the end of that process, you can take a much more iterative and collaborative approach to the design and the build, and you can deliver the solution elements in sprints. And finally, DIY, obviously do it yourself, which in this case means involving internal system administrators in the solution implementation and training from the start, rather than outsourcing it all to an external partner. So what we're going to do is explore each of these three in the context of the Comic Relief project. So firstly, MVP, or Minimum Viable Product. And we've actually shared a white paper in the hub that provides a bit more of an introduction on this concept. But MVP can really help to manage expectations and to stick to budget and timescales. But Jacqui, talk us through the practicalities of sticking to MVP. How did you push back on complexity internally?
Sure. So we did have a set time frame and budget that we needed to stick to. So MVP made absolute sense to us as an approach. And I think in theory, the concept of MVP and the benefits are quite clear and generally something we find that people can understand and can sign up to. But in practice, it wasn't always that straightforward. So when you are faced with implementing a feature or a process that perhaps isn't quite as efficient or isn't quite as user-friendly as your users might be familiar with on their current system, and that you know the tech you're using is very capable of, that can take some negotiation and it can take some discipline as well. So something that we strive to do was to keep particularly our internal users informed and kind of part of the process so that they could understand the approach and really almost sort of selling the benefits into them. So what might have felt like a compromise in the short term means that in the long term they will be able to get some improvements implemented that will actually benefit them the most. So even taking that opportunity to sometimes talk through briefly what some of those future possibilities may look like, to sort of assure them that improvements can be implemented down the line, and also explaining how the decisions will be made and what will be implemented. So we initiated a testing and feedback champions group. We did have some challenges of that due to lockdown, but we intend to set up a similar group to feed into and steer the project post implementation. I think where you have what we were calling MVP plus features or processes, so things that were an improvement on what users were currently used to, I think really making sure you communicate those as you go along as well. So through updates or through show and tells, you know, for us, it wasn't pure compromise across the board. There were areas where MVP on Salesforce were putting us in a better position. So I think really highlighting those things as well can be helpful. And sometimes it's reminding yourself of those benefits and your project team of those benefits, because it can come naturally to want to deliver things as good as they can be and try and make them perfect. So really kind of trying to keep on track and hopefully having an environment where you can challenge each other a bit on that as well. One particularly interesting thing that we find, because of the Salesforce capabilities and because of having a partner that understood how to make the best of the technology, it's quite easy to ask, what would be involved in having this nice to have, and how long would that take, and sort of going for it. And in and of itself, that might not be a problem, that might be quite small, but of course those things can really build up across the piece. So I definitely recommend being aware of that as you go along. And I'd say that some areas of the business, it might have been a bit more challenging. So when it comes to things like finance controls, of course, there's some non-negotiables in there. But even within the area of finance, there were places where you could find a middle ground so that the necessary controls are in place, but those kind of bells and whistles, those automated process can come later down the line.
Thank you. It's a really useful tip there. Let's come on to the Agile process. So although there was at the beginning an initial discovery phase to scope out the solution framework, and we were lucky enough to have that in person, the design and build of each element of the solution really took an Agile approach. And that meant that there was much more flexibility to adapt once Comic Relief understood the platform capabilities. And it was also a great way to maintain continuous communication and to build a relationship between the partners. So Jacqui, talk us a bit through how the Agile process worked for you, and whether you have any tips for organisations considering this approach.
Yeah, of course. So I think we find that Agile did really allow us to adapt to the ever-changing circumstances of the last few months. For us as grant makers, things do change frequently anyway. The timings with open calls, maybe partnerships that come up, but during lockdown that was really amplified. So some things that were planned got pushed way back, and some things we weren't expecting got brought to the forefront. So it did allow us to kind of switch priorities and timing, but not affect the overall budget and timeline. So at the beginning of the project, as you mentioned, we went through the define process with -8 and bringing in lots of users from across the different areas of the business as well. So we identified just the key areas for delivery to get a shared understanding of the overall scope. And then once that was agreed and we went into project implementation, before each sprint we'd be agreeing what was going to be delivered, working in wee sprints initially, which meant that we could be really responsive and really flexible on a weekly basis. And within that, we defined key sprint goals. So although we might be working on different pieces of work, we were able to identify what the priority areas were. The daily contact that we had through stand-ups, because there was so much going on, just having that close contact really allowed us to keep things moving, get feedback in quickly, for example, and just to keep on top of things across the project too. And at the end of each sprint, we would take time to reflect on the previous week. So both on some of the work that had been delivered, but also the process and how we were working together as a team, what our wins were, what we could improve on. And I would really encourage that opportunity of reflection. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of time you spend on it, but it does allow you to really kind of fine tune things as you go along. We worked with users quite a lot as we went along to shape what was being delivered. So as I said, there were challenges with lockdown. So our kind of methods of engagement and feedback weren't quite what we had planned, but we did try to adapt to it. And what we did use, it did allow us to check we were on track. It did allow us to feedback comments and get back kind of further feedback for a later date as well. And we have some really great examples of where this whole kind of process and the sprint cycles worked really well. For example, our assurance reporting piece, it was actually a new process on our new system. And we had a real overview of what we wanted to happen, but we met with users. -8 had kind of a prototype to show, which we were able to talk through and they could feedback on. We had some development, they saw a kind of next version, a bit more feedback, and it was ready to go. And that wasn't something really rigid that was set, several months before. It was very much based on the kind of needs at that time. So this approach, as I mentioned, allowed us to adapt to kind of different timelines, and we did make a number of emergency funding grants, which obviously we hadn't anticipated related to COVID, and we hadn't intended to roll out the startup process when we did. We had procured an e-signature tool for our contract signing, CongaSign, but we hadn't anticipated using it at that point. But we were able to just kind of flip our priorities and focus on getting that piece of work in place and roll out as was required. So there were some challenges with it. I mean, we did have pieces of work that spanned multiple sprints. You know, we were quite a small project team, so our capacity to, you know, brief in, test, work with users, get feedback while still managing our existing systems and workloads, it was sometimes challenging. So it didn't always work really neatly. You know, the pace didn't always continue throughout, but I think sort of accepting that not everything is going to work exactly in practice as it does in theory, you know, it is fine, and obviously it got us to where we needed to be in the end. So I think just my overall tips would just be to get a shared understanding of the overall scope at the beginning, which allows some flexibility for you to focus on things as you go along. Prioritize in sprints so that you can be really adaptable. Get users involved as part of the development as you go along. Keep close contact and communication with the project team, and do try and take those opportunities to reflect as you go along.
Perfect. And I think it's worth pointing out that, you know, it's quite often that a hybrid approach would be taken where if Agile isn't exactly the right approach for your organisation, you can also adopt some elements of it to help that process. So the final part of the kind of three elements is DIY. And what we mean by this is that Comic Relief had system administrators from the start involved in the implementation and the training. And there are a number of benefits to this approach. It can keep costs down. It means there's knowledge sharing from the start. And it also means you can produce your own training documentation as you go along. But were there any challenges for you internally, Jacqui, to taking this approach?
There were, yes. And I mean, our plan was always to have as much internal self-sufficiency as possible, looking forward to reduce our costs and have greater ownership, and also be more responsive to our users. But we've taken a number of different approaches as we've gone along. So we've had some specific sessions with Hyphenate in terms of areas of administration and configuration on the system, or third-party tools we were using, which were really helpful. And we've done some self-guided learning as well. And also just sort of asking questions and being curious as you go along. So when things are talked about being implemented, just trying to understand, you know, what part of the system is that using, having, you know, maybe a quick demo on how something's done, just to sort of learn in bits as you go along. But I guess the biggest challenge for us was that sometimes we just did not have the capacity, even if we had all the will in the world, and even if we knew how to do something ourselves, inevitably it may take us a bit longer because we were new and we were learning, and sometimes we just didn't have that time. So we would have to ask Hyphenate to kind of pick up some bits and pieces, which, you know, fortunately they were always able to do. So I think in some respects we might have tried a bit too much, a bit too early. I would kind of recommend trying to be a bit smart about the kind of ordering and the timing. So you don't need to dive into everything straight away and all the details. I think trying to understand a bit how the kind of bigger pieces of the system fit together and then focus in as you go along is a more helpful approach. But, you know, nonetheless, we've got to where we are now. We're out of implementation phase, and we're working with our partners on specific kind of guidance and advice and troubleshooting. But, you know, we're continuously taking on more and more ourselves as we go forward.
Thanks, Jacqui. That's really useful advice. And just as a closing question, if you look back on this process, what would be your top advice to an organisation considering embarking on a new technology project right now?
So I would say be realistic. about what can be achieved, so, like particularly if you have obviously tight timescales and tight budget. There was an element of our project that we were sort of borderline about whether we would include or not, and it was an example of something that was MVP plus, and we got it in, and we were able to get there, but it did cause some strain at some point. So I think just don't set yourself up for a fall with that, and there's always opportunities to get things in kind of later on. Similarly, I would suggest to be clear about what MVP looks like and try to stay fairly disciplined to that, you know, thinking about the benefits and the end goal, and the fact that development doesn't end once the initial implementation has ended. I would suggest to really, I mean, engaging users, I think is always of critical importance, but when you're talking about new technology projects, I think it could really be make or break. So we involved users right from the initial system review, through procurement process, through the design, through the development, and yeah, I guess being creative with lockdown, but I think user engagement's a really key one for me. I would say for us, phased delivery of the rollout was really helpful. Again, because of our restricted capacity, it meant that we were able to focus on specific areas of rollout at a time. So whether that was a pilot of our live grantees, whether it was grant startup, whether it was kind of decision meetings, and you can just deal with, obviously related to that, there's the planning and communication and rollout and training and dealing with any immediate issues. So it may not be an option for everyone because of time constraints, but even we had a fixed deadline for everything to be in place, and then just worked backwards and did a mixture of operations across 2 systems during the implementation phase. Lastly, I would say the selection of partners. If you are working with implementing partners, I think selecting partners that have that expertise and understanding of your sector, so that you're not having to spend, you know, precious time and energy explaining concepts and processes, and it also minimises the opportunity for misunderstanding. And I think, you know, hopefully you can really benefit from expertise on best practice from their experience of working with other organisations like yours. Obviously, choosing partners that know the technology that you're working with really well and how to get the best out of it. And also, I'd say partners that can support you with the project approach that you're taking. So if you are using an agile approach, one that very much can kind of work within that framework and support you on it. And I would say we've gained, you know, a huge amount of value out of our strong partner selection that has really supported us to achieve our overall goals in this project, despite the context of lockdown.
Thank you, Jacqui. So I think in summary, yes, there were some ups and downs, but what you've shared are some really useful and practical tips about how it is possible to have a successful implementation given the right approach. So thank you for your time, Jacqui.
No problem, it's a pleasure. Thank you.